Hello and welcome to Dyslexia Explored. I'm Darius Nomdaron, your host, and today we're going to hear the dyslexia story of a mother who's been a primary school teacher in her day, who's a Senko in the UK here, and also has amassed quite a TikTok following for her straight down the line discussions and explanations about dyslexia. Jo Rees, it's great to have you with us here.
Thank you so much for inviting me to share my dyslexic story.
So, give people a bit of an idea of where you're at right now, and then we'll rewind to the beginning and join the dots.
Yeah, okay. So right now, I am a mum of 3 teenagers, happily married, and working for myself, running a company that's currently called Another Way Around Dyslexia Support, but I'm in the middle of a rebrand, and I think we'll talk about that a bit later on. And mostly what I do is independent dyslexia assessments and diagnosis. I work with parents quite a lot, coaching them and kind of empowering them to support their children. And I deliver inset training to schools, face to face and online.
Fantastic. So, how many dyslexia assessments do you do in a month, for example? Give us an idea.
It really varies depending on what else is going on. So I can do anywhere from 4 to 10. It just depends what's going on. So one of the beauties of working for myself is I can work around the children, and my girls do an awful lot of performing, and I like to get kind of quite involved with that in supporting them. There's a lot of taxiing around. So for example, March with the dyslexia show as well, and they had some big productions and things going on. Didn't manage to do very many assessments that month, but this month I've done lots. So yeah, it just depends.
So, is it unusual to have a dyslexia assessor who's got dyslexia?
I actually genuinely don't know. I have met a couple of other assessors that have got dyslexia. And it's really interesting because recently I assessed a family friend's child. And when they received the, like, they knew what I did, but they kind of had no idea how in depth it was. And when they received the report, they messaged me and they were like, "Oh my goodness, Jo, like, how on earth do you produce that report? Like, being dyslexic." And I was like, "Oh, I don't really know. I haven't really thought about it." But I think for me, it wasn't an easy road for sure. I did have my dyslexia diagnosis. I didn't when I did the specialist teacher training. I actually got my dyslexia diagnosis after I trained to become an assessor. But I think for me, it wasn't easy, but I was so driven because I wanted the skill to be able to help people, that was kind of my motivation. And I can't lie, I still don't find it easy. I have to have a proofreader. I have to pay for a proofreader to read the reports. Otherwise, there'd be no hope because they're huge, great big long documents. But yeah, I guess it's an interesting dynamic for sure. I'm definitely not the only dyslexic assessor out there. But I guess if you're dyslexic yourself and you've had a challenging time, it's perfect motivation, isn't it?
Yes. And it's a perfect insight and empathy and understanding for the person on the other side. Actually, I've interviewed a number of dyslexia assessors in on the
Mm.
podcast over the years, the last 6 years of this podcast. And it's surprising how many of them are not dyslexic, because your default might be thinking that those who've got dyslexia might be attracted to do it to help other people. But actually, there's so much procedural stuff involved in doing a dyslexia assessment successfully and the report afterwards. It's quite a long procedural process for you to go through. So let's wind back. Okay.
We were.
There was a time before you knew you had dyslexia. Okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what I'm fascinated by here in this podcast is just hearing what the wake up call was for you. Okay. So, what was life like before dyslexia being identified? And then what was the wake up call? Now, you can rewind back as far as you like. What was life like at school, etc., for you?
So it's an interesting one because actually I learnt to read really quickly, supposedly. So all those years ago when I was at school, you used to have words in tins that you would kind of work your way through and basically memorize. You weren't decoding, you were literally just memorizing them. And I was one of the first people, I remember it really clearly, was one of the first people in my class to get an actual reading book because I could read enough words. And it was the old Jennifer and Johnny Yellow Hat, the Billy Blue Hat books. And I actually, again, was one of the first children in my class to become a free reader. But the thing was, once you became a free reader, nobody checked that you could understand what you were reading. But also, nobody checked that you could decode longer words. So actually, what I'd done was, and I know this now looking back, I didn't know it at the time, was I just memorized lots of words and just made it look like I could read, became this free reader, and then completely lost interest in reading because I couldn't break the words down. And I can remember I read all of the famous 5 books. My uncle gave them to me. And I can remember working my way through all of the famous 5 books. But actually, I used to really struggle with names. I used to quite often kind of skip words. But it didn't matter because nobody noticed. And all they saw was me kind of working through these books. So therefore, that was success. But what that did internally was, from quite an early age, and I'm talking probably 8 or 9, it led me to blagging. It's the only word I can use. So when people, I kind of found ways round. If people did ask me questions, I could kind of steer the conversation to a bit that I had understood or a bit that I had got, or put my own opinion on something that had happened. So from quite an early age, I was masking and hiding that weakness. And then when I moved, so when I was at school, we had a 3-tier system. We had primary, middle, and high. When I moved to middle school, at primary school, I was kind of top set, not top set, but, quite able, felt quite confident. And then I moved to middle school, and literally as that transition happened, quite a significant life event happened to me. I lost both of my grandfathers within the space of 3 months, which was obviously quite a traumatic experience. And it isn't, again, when I look back now, I realize how traumatic that was. But actually, I moved to middle school and suddenly started to find things a lot more difficult and started to slip down sets, but was really confused because I was excelling the same amount of effort and I was still working really hard. But for whatever reason, I was no longer top of the class. I'd sort of moved to the middle of the class. Not that top of the class mattered, but what mattered to me was, and I didn't verbalize any of this, why was I trying as hard as I'd always tried? And why was that effort not equaling a top grade? And lots of my issues around self-esteem, lots of my difficulty in managing my emotions at the time were put down to this traumatic event that I'd lost both of my grandfathers, which was, of course, traumatic. But again, that added this layer of nobody really looking at what was going on educationally for me, because she'd experienced this huge life event, which was the reason for her very emotional behavior. And the reason perhaps why she wasn't doing as well as she had done at primary school or the previous year, because actually she had a lot going on emotionally. So that was the start of me beginning to doubt my ability and the confidence in myself. And then I can remember I had one teacher one particular year that just didn't get me. And I was bullied quite badly by 2 girls. I hate using that word bully, but actually I was. And I was bullied because I was classed as being a SWAT, because I always had double of equipment, because, I always did my homework on time. I wasn't prepared to mess about. I was always really listening. And actually, the reason why I had double equipment was because if I lost one, because that happened to me quite a lot, it meant that I always had a spare one. No, I didn't mess about because I needed to listen, because the chances were I knew even if I was listening, I wasn't going to understand. So I was going to have to ask questions. Again, no idea at the time that these were strategies, that these were ways of me compensating and coping. So by the time I went to high school, actually, I was a pretty broken mess, if I'm honest. And by that point, I discovered that I loved drama and I loved acting and I loved dancing and I loved performing. And I really wanted to be a musical theatre star. That's what I wanted to do. And I can remember the first time we did Shakespeare, And I was so confused as to why I didn't get it, because I loved English, I love words, I loved drama. This was a play. Why am I not understanding this? And I can remember it was at that point I started to really make myself invisible at school. So in the book that I've written called Don't Forget to Smile, which is a memoir of kind of my life before dyslexia, I talk about it was almost like a game with the teachers where I wore a virtual invisibility cloak. And if I managed to get through a lesson without a teacher noticing me or asking me a question, then that was a win to me. And if a teacher did kind of, I viewed it at the time as catching me out and kind of helped me with that learning, then that was one up to them and one down to me. So I needed to try harder the next day to keep myself invisible. And it's important to remember that all of this is before technology even really existed. Like there weren't even really, you didn't have a computer at your home, even really when I took my GCSEs, sort of like word processor type things came in when I did my A levels. I can remember typing for A levels, but there wasn't spell check. You couldn't go back and edit things.
It was Tipex.
It was Tipex, absolutely. And I can remember when I got my GCSE results, now when you look back, they are classic dyslexic in presentation. And interestingly, my daughter took her GCSEs last year and they're really similar in presentation. But, you know, I got a D for history because I just wasn't interested in that. I got C's for science and DT and maths. I don't know how I passed maths, but I did. And that's all that matters. I didn't need to retake it. B's for English because I loved it. A B for French because the teacher just got me and was incredible with me. And I spent a lot of lunch times working with her. And then A's for art and drama. If that's not classic dyslexic in presentation, but nobody picked up on it because it was Jo and she appeared to be confident on the surface. She was just an average attaining kid. But when it came to picking A levels, that was a different kettle of fish because nobody wanted me on their A-level course because they could see the amount of effort I'd excelled for GCSEs. You had to study 3 A-levels. 2 were easy. It would be theatre studies and it would be art. But what about the third one? I desperately wanted to study English, but the English teachers just didn't want me on their course. The French teacher said, I would love for you to do French, Jo, because I love you, but you are not going to be able to sustain the amount of effort that you did to pass your GCSE for A-level. So I ended up taking English, and my English A-level teachers hated me. They had no time for me. They both told me that I wasn't university material and I should be looking at an apprenticeship route. And when I got my A-level result, I got a B for theatre studies, a C for art, and an E for English. And I can remember going to my English teacher and saying, I've got an E for excellent. And actually, I've got that completely off my own back because none of you have helped me. Like literally, that I had a friend actually who was incredible. And actually, she should take the credit for the E because it was her that had a lot of patience with me, shared notes with me, had discussions with me. Again, it was before email, like you hand wrote everything.
Give her a shout out. What's her name?
Yeah, her name is Charlotte. And I am friends with her on Facebook. Haven't seen her since school. We keep threatening to meet up, but she is quoted in my book as well. But interestingly, that E was the 2 points, 2 UCAS points, because remember, sometimes we need to look at the bigger picture. And that was the 2 UCAS points I needed to get into the university of my choice, because actually I'd been predicted 2 Bs and I got a B and then the C for art. And luckily that E was the shortfall and gave me the points that I needed to get into the university of my choice. So what my English teachers viewed as a failure was actually a massive success, because actually altogether that effort and that work got me where I wanted for university. And I did get a degree against the odds. But yeah,
what
so
did
that
you
was
do?
Sort of my school journey. Well, played to my strengths, again, not realizing I was playing my strengths. Can you guess what I took a degree in?
Drama and something to do with drama.
Well, dance and drama was what I took my degree in. However, this will make you laugh. So I was the first person in my family to go to university. So I haven't actually talked about the fact that I grew up in a very working class family. My dad worked at the same factory for many, many years. I can't remember exactly how many years, over 30. He worked in an aircraft factory. He left school with no qualifications at the age of 15. And I have since diagnosed him. He is dyslexic. But he is one of the cleverest people I know when it comes to being practical, woodwork, that sort of thing. And that's what he should have done. He should have played to his entrepreneurial strengths, but he just didn't. And that a whole other podcast episode. But I was actually the first person in my family to head off to university. So nobody in my family understood what university was like, understood the UCAS process. I'd sort of bluffed my way through it. I don't really know how I'd got there, but I had. And it turned out that the degree course that I desperately wanted to do, because it happened to be close to my boyfriend, who is now my husband at the time, when I got there, I had to study English as well. And I hadn't read, I'd misread it and not realized. So ended up having to study English for another 3 years, only one module. But it was just when I look back now, how classic dyslexic is that in terms of misreading and misunderstanding and kind of not getting it. And I can remember just getting there and just thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to do English for a whole other kind of year, 3 years. But anyway, we did it. Luckily, it wasn't triple. It was just a with dance drama with English in contemporary culture was the name of my actual degree. But yeah, I just, how ironic was that? So yeah, so university was not a pleasant experience for me. I found it really difficult to make friends. I'd come from the Isle of Wight. If I'm really honest, I was not prepared to move to the big city of Bedford and experience the multicultural that there was, experience even just living in a city. I had been off island, odd times to Portsmouth and Southampton, but in all honesty, we hadn't been very many places growing up. So it was a massive shock to suddenly be in this city, and I'm just going to turn my emails off, to be in this city and suddenly feel very lonely. But also, I just wasn't prepared to cope with everyday life. And again, now I've got my diagnosis, I can see where dyslexia was showing up for me. But at the time, I had no clue that the things that I was finding difficult were associated to dyslexia. So, for example, I struggled to write checks. Thank goodness we don't have to write checks anymore, people. But, I can remember going and buying books and not knowing how to write the numbers, because my strategy to cope with not knowing how to spell was I just wrote the numbers, the digits. But actually, you had to write the words on a check. And I can remember just being mortified and thinking, I don't know how to do that. I could never get the right information on the right place on a check. And it was because obviously when you wrote a check, somebody tended to be looking at you. And I found that kind of quite stressful. I didn't have much money because all of my money went on texts, because I couldn't rely on borrowing a book from the library, because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to read it within the time limit. And having a time limit somehow made it even more difficult for me to read it. So I needed to have my own copies of text so that I could write in them, so that I could highlight them, so that, they were mine, so I could go back and refer to them as many times as needed. So that meant that, and university books are expensive. So it meant that I didn't have any money to go out socializing, which actually suited me quite nicely because I didn't have the confidence to go into the bar and buy a drink. I didn't have the confidence really to talk to people that I didn't know. So what happened was at university, I became really very isolated and very lonely. But again, because of all of the overreading I had to do and because of the amount of effort it took me to put into an assignment, that kind of suited me quite nicely because it meant that I could just focus on the work. And actually, if I went out at university, I got a 2-1 for my degree. I'm not sure I would have got a 2-1. I might have got a 2-2 because I did have to put so much effort in. And really interestingly, again, there was this pattern. Anything that was practical, really high marks. Anything that was written was literally just a scrape by. And that's how I got my 2-1, I think. But whilst at university, I found this little sanctuary. So again, it was before email. So with life admin and stuff, if letters came through from the bank or if there were issues with rent or stuff like that, I had to go to a telephone box and phone my parents. Couldn't screenshot it to them and send it to them. Couldn't email them and ask them to read it kind of with me. Didn't want to let on to the people I was living with that I was struggling with that. And I found this little sanctuary. So I decided by then that musical theatre was not for me, probably. I didn't have the confidence. I probably wasn't good enough. I'd fallen in love. Like I say, I was backwards and forwards to York from Bedford to see my now husband quite a lot. I wanted to become a primary school teacher. So I decided to start volunteering, and I did it for the full 3 years I was at Bedford. One afternoon a week, I went in and I listened to children read, children that struggled. And I loved it. It was my favorite 2 hours of the week. It was my safe place. There were adults there that made me tea. They hugged me. They looked after me. They had no idea that I was struggling, but it was just like, yes, there are adults. Like I'm in a safe place. And I remember one particular time when I was asked to read a story aloud to the whole class. Well, again, talk about exposing dyslexia. I hadn't read aloud for literally years. So they hand me this children's book and I start reading this children's book. And it becomes apparent, yes, you're reading at an angle, but actually I can't read fluently. Like I can't read out loud. Like, what is wrong with me? Like I clearly need to practice this. So I sort of managed to get through. Anyway, at the end of the day, I said to the teacher, I'm just going to take a couple of books home. And I can't remember what I said. I gave some excuse that I wanted to kind of, I don't know, reminisce for when I was a child, something like that. And basically, I memorized these books by heart so that the next time I was asked to read aloud, I'd pre-read it and didn't really need to look at the words because I knew roughly what was going on. Master strategy or what? Again, hadn't really crossed my mind that I was dyslexic, just thought that I wasn't very clever and like just probably needed to practice that a bit more. And it was actually the adults in the school that helped me apply for my postgraduate certificate. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have got on a teacher training course. They helped me do my application form. They helped me do my personal statement. They were my network of adults. I didn't find the lecturers to be particularly supportive. Plus, I was working very hard to keep my struggles hidden because I didn't want to look stupid. That invisibility cloak was so tight. But actually, the teachers at the school had become almost my family over the couple of years in terms of the adults. So they were the ones that helped me kind of negotiate that. And I can remember they threw a surprise party for me when I got into Winchester to do my postgraduate certificate in teaching. They threw a little party in the staff room to celebrate my success. So yeah, that was my degree story.
Fantastic. This podcast is sponsored by dyslexiaproductivitycoaching.com, which helps you organize yourself creatively with a productivity system for Apple devices. So what woke you up to dyslexia? Was it a person?
Yeah, but
it's normally a person.
Yeah, but I'm not there yet. It was a good 10 years after that, maybe 8 years after that I actually discovered I was dyslexic. So I did my postgraduate certificate. And interestingly, that was a strategy in itself because all those things I didn't understand, I could suddenly relearn. Wouldn't teach above Key Stage 1. I was like, I'm going to be a Key Stage 1 teacher because I felt like I could be secure in the knowledge of what Key Stage 1 needed.
Well, I know exactly how you feel because I'm a ex-primary school teacher as well.
Oh.
And I did a law degree at Edinburgh University.
Yeah.
I quit the law degree 3 years in, and did a joinery training course for a year and a half because I wanted to do something practical. Went back, finished my degree, and then my parents were like, great, you've got your law degree finally, okay? And then I said, I want to be a primary school teacher now. And they're like, what? And so I became a primary school teacher. And just like you, I thought I could teach young children,
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And I loved, and obviously I'd worked in the school, so I knew that I loved, and I literally stuck to year 1 and year 2 while I'd been there, but had just really enjoyed it. And I knew I was good at it, and I was good at it. Like, one of my strengths is building relationships with kids, but also because I had kept my weaknesses hidden, I knew exactly where to look. like to find those kids that were struggling, to find those kids that were saying that they could do it and actually couldn't. And the reason why I passed my postgraduate certificate is because of my really, really good friend, Lisa. We happened to walk through the door at the same time. And she has been one of my best friends ever since. And it won't surprise you to know that, well, she's now a head teacher, but for years she was a Senko and ran a behavior unit, because she was the first person other than my husband to see my weaknesses, but she dealt with them the same way as my husband. They didn't admit that they were there. They just knew how to support me and love me and encourage me. So she would quite often, when I look back now, I realize what she was doing. She would quite often model things to me, or she would quite often say, so are you sure you understand this assignment? This is what we've got to do. She would like break it down for me. So I passed my postgraduate certificate. And again, won't surprise everybody to know that my lesson observations were always outstanding. And the written work was always just scraped through. And I was super lucky because I got the first job I applied for in what was, it was called a beacon school at the time. They would now be called outstanding schools. And it was actually the worst year of my teaching career, and I nearly gave up teaching. Because actually, yes, it was an outstanding school, but there was no way you could use your teacher gut feeling or autonomy. So it was actually a 3-form entry school, and I was the newly qualified teacher in amongst 2 very experienced teachers. And I can remember, so we did the planning between us. So that was amazing because it meant that I only had to do planning once every 3 weeks, if that makes sense. So it could take me 3 weeks to do the plan. So actually, it didn't matter that it took me longer to do it because I would have the time to do it because of that network around me. But I can remember once we were doing symmetry, and it wasn't a plan that I'd created. So again, as a dyslexic, I know following somebody else's plan can be quite tricky because it's not necessarily playing to your strengths or thinking how your brain thinks. So I'd sort of got the resources out, which was kind of like shapes and cubes and things. And we were doing symmetry, and the kids were just not getting it. So halfway through the lesson, I was like, right, guys, let's put that away. We covered the tables in newspaper. We got the paints out. We got paper out. We folded it in, we did butterfly pictures, basically. We painted one side of the paper. They folded it in half. They opened it up. We cleared it all up. We sat in a circle with their pictures. And I was like, you're going to take it in turns, one at a time, to tell me where the symmetry is on your picture. It was an incredible lesson. It still gives me goosebumps now. And I can remember there was a glass door in between my classroom and the classroom next door. And I can remember one of the teachers that was my mentor, like peering through the door as if to say, what is she doing? Anyway, I tried to ignore that and kind of focus on the children, because in my head, I'm thinking she's looking through the window because she's going, oh my goodness, this she's an incredible teacher because she's going with what the children need. And this is just brilliant. Anyway, it gets to this little girl called Chelsea. Remember it really clearly. And she's got tears in her eyes. So I say, Chelsea, what's the matter? And she said, I'm really sad, Miss Rees. I haven't got any symmetry on my picture because I didn't know that you had to fold it in half. So I've painted the whole thing. And I said, but you've learned what symmetry is because you know that your picture hasn't got any symmetry. So next time you know how to look for symmetry. So she beamed and she was like, yes, that's amazing. I've got goosebumps now. It was just one of those really incredible moments. And the children just went into spontaneous applause. It was just one of those really, really lovely moments. So off I send them to lunch, feeling really happy with myself. Anyway, the next thing I know, this teacher that's looked through the door is in my classroom, hands on hips. She said, I'm just giving you the heads up. Never do that again. Never paint in the morning. The mornings are for structure. So I was like, well, we were doing symmetry. It was on the plan. I followed the plan, but the kids weren't getting it with the task. I was really struggling to teach it. Every single one of their children has got the objective of symmetry, I promise you. And she was like, well, I'm telling you, if the head teacher walks past and sees you with paints out in the morning, you'll get a warning. So I was like, okay. So it was really interesting. And it was at that point I thought, this school is not for me, because actually I need to be free to go with what my children need. And yes, I get that there's a curriculum, but surely as long as I get to the learning objective with the children and the children secure it, it shouldn't matter how I get there. So I was only in that school for a year, still didn't know I was dyslexic at this point. Moved to another school and ended up with the set of children. So this particular school was a 2-form entry school, and it's set across the 2 year 3 and year 4 classes. And I arrived and I was told, you have got the set with all their, it was statements at the time, statements and SEN kids in it. And because nobody else wants to teach that set. So I was like, that's okay, I'm up for that. But they were like, the good thing is you do have 2 teaching assistants if you have that set, because you have the top set's teaching assistant, because the top set doesn't need a teaching assistant. So I was like, it's great, I don't have a problem with that. Well, as you can imagine, because I'm like a magnet, I just had this whole class of children that I just totally got 2 adults to help me. So it was just incredible. And by the end of that year, my children had made the same progress as the set above. They were all in line. Their attainment was in line. So I was like, I'm actually pretty good at this. Like, I can do this. Like, yes, I'm in year 3 and I really didn't want to be in year 3, but actually I'm teaching all morning the kids with SEN. So actually, not that I haven't got high expectations, but we can totally do this, because this is about securing basic skill, and this is about teaching kind of critical thinking skill and kind of learning behaviors. I can do that. And then in the afternoon, we can do like the topic work. That all felt like totally achievable and totally doable. So at the end of my first year, I was approached and asked if I would like to be the Senko, because you clearly have got like a really good understanding of SEN kids. How would you feel about becoming the Senko?
Could you explain what a Senko is?
Yes,
please?
so a Senko is a special educational needs coordinator. So every school has to have one. It's a compulsory role, and we coordinate special educational needs within the school. Now, you think that means that you'd get to do some sort of teaching. My harsh reality check was, actually, you don't really get to work with any children at all. It's all paperwork. It's all meeting with parents, and it's basically coordinating annual reviews. So if children they're now called EHCs, they have to have a yearly review. It's about keeping the SEND register up to date. There is an element of training staff and talking about it in staff meetings. It's managing the smallest budget you've ever imagined to buy in resources or assessments for children. And it was a whole load of paperwork that I didn't actually need. But didn't matter, because I only had to do it for a year, and I kind of bluffed my way through, because then I fell pregnant. And when I came back from having my first child, I came back part-time, and my cleverest compensatory strategy ever was I convinced the school we had a really high level of SEND, special educational needs children, and I convinced the head teacher that it could be a non-class-based role that just literally focused on doing the paperwork and coordinating SEN, and then I could do a little bit of teaching as well. And the head teacher agreed. So I was like, and the other reason why this was a strategy was because we were due Ofsted. And if you've worked in a school, you'll know that your planning formats are supposed to be consistent. Well, they were in the 2 schools I worked in across the whole school. I really struggled with that, because I just couldn't get the information I needed. I found that it really stilted my creative thinking when it came to planning. So I'd worked out quite quickly in my first school that actually, if my children were making really good progress, nobody looked at the plans. So I kind of had got away with it, but I knew that with Ofsted imminent, I wasn't going to get away with it. So I was like, how can I find a way around this? So my way around it was to become this non-class-based Senko. I did that 2.5 days a week.
A non-class-based Senko.
So quite often, Senkos do that responsibility on top of their teaching commitments.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I had half a day a week, but then I would teach for 4 days a week, because then I had my half day planning and preparation that teachers get. But basically, you did that job on top of your teaching role. So what I thought was amazing and was really flattered by actually doubled my workload.
Yeah.
Didn't particularly matter at the time because I didn't have children and I was so dedicated to my job, like it didn't matter. But obviously, when I went back part-time and I had my own child, I didn't particularly want to be spending, well, I didn't have time to spend the amount of time that I'd spent before. So yeah, so for 3 years I worked just being a Senko 2.5 days a week. It was just incredible. Had another child in between that. And then I was approached by the local authority they had an opportunity coming up for a specialist teacher of dyslexia running an outreach provision. And they asked me to apply. But they said, if you get it, you will have to do a postgraduate certificate in dyslexia. And I was like, yeah, I'm well up to that. That's brilliant. So I got this job and started it. So I had 2 children under 3 at the time.
So give us how many years ago is this roughly now?
Oh my goodness, what would I have been? 28? I don't know how many years. I can't do numbers. I'm now nearly 46. So yeah, so nearly 20 years ago. Nearly 20 years ago.
28, 46. Yeah, 18 years ago.
Yeah, 18 years ago. Yeah, and this is my dyslexic moment. I head off to this course. So it was an online course, but the initial bit was a 4-day residential. So bearing in mind, I've been teaching, been a Senko, have a degree, got A-levels, got GCSEs. I just feel like I'm a bit stupid at times, but it's because I don't read enough. If I read more, I'd get it. Off I go to this course, 4-day residential. And one of the first thing they do is they ask us, what letters, can you tell me the vowels? To like this whole group of people. So in my head, I'm thinking, I don't actually really know what the vowels are. Well, I do know what the vowels are. So I give the vowels out, and then they ask us to say the vowels, the long and the short sound in our groups. And I'm thinking, I'm going to need to listen to this because they've got 2 sounds. Vowels have got 2 sounds. How do I not know? How have I not realized that vowels have got 2 sounds? And that was the cogs at this point begin to blur because they're saying words with the vowels with long and short sounds in them. And I'm really having to think to hear the difference, like it is not natural for me. And then like a few other things are talked about. They began to talk about processing and how information gets filed away. Then they show some like typical dyslexic errors in terms of spelling. And I'm like, literally every single one of those is like my nemesis. And I basically walk away from that 4-day initial teacher training in my head, haven't verbalized it to anybody. And in my head, I'm like, I'm dyslexic. I'm pretty sure I'm dyslexic. That's why I've struggled. But, it is what it is. I've coped with it this far. Just get on with it. So I do. So I continue to get on with it, have another baby, do a diploma, the assessor's diploma, the level 7 assessor's diploma, 6 months pregnant with my third, finish it while she's 6 months old. And then my son at this point has started school and he is super bright. His vocabulary from a really early age was just incredible. Like he can talk to adults better than I can at like 6 years old. Like his vocabulary was just incredible. He asked questions. He was inquisitive. Like he totally got it. We go to school and he just cannot grasp reading. And he just can't write. Like his writing is really weak. Like he's not matching the sounds to letters like he should be matching sounds to letters. By this point, I've got my specialist qualification and I can see dyslexia screaming itself at me. And so that was kind of a bit of a trigger. And then I can remember having a conversation with my mum, and my mum hates that I use this story, but it's not her fault. It just shows how misunderstood dyslexia is. So I say to her, I think I'm going to get Billy an assessment for dyslexia because I think he's really struggling. Like he seems to be really behind everybody. And I'm really worried about his academic progress. He was in year 1 at the time. And my mum said, look, she said, I'm not meaning to be unkind. She said, but we can't all be academic like you. I think that he's just going to have a very practical job. And I think that you're just pushing something that isn't there. You know, your dad isn't particularly academic and he's just going to be like him. And I can remember saying to my mum, like, I'm not being funny, mum, but Bills is at school 50 years after my dad. Like, he is not going to have the same experience that my dad had. That cannot happen. And it was at that point, it was the first time I verbalized out loud. I said to my mum, and I think I'm dyslexic. It's hereditary. I think dad's dyslexic. I think I'm dyslexic. And I think Billy's dyslexic. My mum said to me, you're not dyslexic. You've got a degree. You've always found learning so easy. And it was at that point I was like, right, I need to get an assessment because actually, you know, you listen to your parents, don't you? You listen to your mother. And she said, you know, I did question your spelling when you were in year 3, and Mrs. Smart said to me that the spelling would just come and that it was, you just had lots of ideas and you thought really quickly. And, you know, I did question it and they told me that you weren't. So it was at that point I was like, right, I need to seek an assessment because I need to not prove my mum wrong, but I needed to validate my own struggles because I was like, actually, if I can validate my own struggles and make sense of my own life, I'm going to be in a really powerful position to support Billy in managing his dyslexia going forward. And actually, if I'm not dyslexic, that's okay. Then maybe I am just not very clever and I need to work harder. But at that point, I just needed to know. And at that point, I was at that point, I didn't do anything about it. I didn't actually do anything about it until I was 34. And I don't know what it was that led to me getting it done. But
How
one
many
day,
years from that conversation with your mum to when you got it done?
it must have been 3 or 4.
3 or 4 years. You put it on the back
It
burner.
must have been 3 or 4. Yeah, I put it on the back burner. And that was partly because, oh, how deep do you want to go in this podcast? So that was partly because when I look back now, I was in complete dyslexic burnout. So I had had 3 children in 5 years. I had omitted to mention that I'd also done a nurture group qualification. So I had done a nurture group qualification, my postgraduate certificate in dyslexia, diploma in dyslexia, and a postgraduate certificate in Senko accreditation in that 5 years as well. I don't know what I was thinking, but I did. And with each child that came along, I was finding my dyslexia was coming more and more prominent. So not only was I having to remember dates and appointments for myself, I was having to run diaries and remember dates and appointments for them. I was sleep deprived. You are sleep deprived when you've got children. So actually that meant that I couldn't be as effective in the day as I needed to be. I was making a lot more dyslexic errors. I couldn't work when my brain worked best. You know, my brain works best first thing in the morning, and actually the children were awake before I was awake. So I couldn't even get ahead of the game, getting on top of life admin and stuff before they got up.
I think it's useful to clarify a little bit there that you're talking about dyslexic traits, and some people might be thinking dyslexic traits might just be difficulty with reading or reports and so on, but you're describing executive function challenges and working memory functions and so on. Could you just help people understand what you now realize were dyslexic traits getting in the way then?
Yeah. So I have now learned that dyslexia is about reading, writing, and spelling, but actually it's a spectrum of difficulties that make reading, writing, and spelling tricky. So phonological awareness is what makes processing sounds difficult, which is what impacts reading and spelling. We can find ways around that, but it never becomes what we call automatic. We have to think about it. It's also about short-term working memory. So that doesn't just impact reading, it impacts the amount of information we can process and hold on to at any time. It's about processing speed and the speed that it takes us to think and do things. And for me, my dyslexia, I think it's probably also important to point out that dyslexia manifests itself slightly differently in everybody, which is why we need to understand how it manifests itself in ourselves so that we know what strategies to put in place to support us. So one of the things I would say is when I look back now, dyslexia probably impacted me way more as an adult than it did in education. And I think the reason for that was because in education, it's really rule-based. So as much as my school days were the worst days of my life, it was rule-based. You had to be at lessons at certain times, you had a routine, It was very structured. People told you when things needed to be handed in. You know, there were clear people you could go to ask for help in particular subjects. The same kind of through university. It was very structured. Whereas in life, it's nowhere near as clear as that. And actually, you feel stupid for getting an appointment, turning up to an appointment at the wrong time, forgetting your child's parents' evening, turning up to a child's party half an hour late. You know, and actually, because I still didn't realize I was dyslexic in those early days of having children, I honestly thought that I had postnatal depression. And actually, after my third child, as I say, I finished my diploma in dyslexia assessment. And I should have been so excited when that came through the door because it was a massive achievement. And I remember it clear as clear. I can remember being stood in my kitchen, and at the time I was surrounded by 150 cupcakes because I'd made cakes for a really good friend's birthday, because constantly I pushed myself to do stupid things because I wanted people to love me and like me, because I felt like I wasn't good enough. So I always needed to go the extra mile. And I can remember being stood in the middle of all of these cupcakes with this letter, with Jemima fast asleep and a bouncy chair, reading it and not feeling anything, just feeling so numb and thinking, what next? Like, I've got to this top of I've got to the top of this mountain. This should feel incredible, and I feel nothing. Why do I feel nothing? And I can remember looking at Jemima, looking at my pristine house, which was pristine because then that was my coping strategy. Everything had to have a place. Everything had to be tidy because then I knew exactly where to look for things. And that was exhausting. And I can remember reaching out to an independent counsellor and saying, I think I've got postnatal depression. I think I need some help. And actually, when we unpicked it, and by then, like I say, I trained to be, I could talk through all of this journey with her. And at the very end of sort of 6 or 7 sessions, she said to me, this isn't about postnatal depression. This is neurodiverse burnout. Luckily, the counsellor that I happened to pick had a neurodiverse son, so actually knew quite a lot about neurodiversity. She said, this is neurodiverse burnout as a result of undiagnosed dyslexia. You need to get an assessment.
She was your wake-up call.
She was my wake-up call, and I've only just realised that now. Yeah, it was her. She was like, you need to get an assessment because you need to validate those not good enough feelings. So, yeah, so that was a little while, 3 or 4 years after having that conversation with my mum. Because I'd been
And then how long did it take after she pointed that out before you got your assessment? Would you say months?
Probably about a year.
A year.
So she pointed it out to me, and then I think Bill was struggling, and I was like, actually, do you know what? I just need to, I need to know so that I can help him.
What a story! What a story!
Yeah, I think, sorry, it was a long one.
No, it's a great story. Let's keep going on the story. I'm loving this, but what I'd like to do is just pause and reflect back on that, you know, and the lessons we can kind of learn. You know, like what I'm seeing is that it's shouting out to us that you needed to go and get that personal awareness of what your difficulties were, and yet you were so focused on other people's dyslexia, other people's special education needs. You know, for years you're doing it for other people, but you're not doing it for yourself. And how telling is that? And how often is that the case? Like, I mean, you even see it in the workplace right now. Like, I've got people that I'm saying to them, look, do the access to work application. Like, yeah. I'll do the access to work application. You know, 3 years later, I'm like, did you do the access to work application? I'm like, oh, it's still on my to-do list. I'm like, I will meet with you tomorrow for half an hour and we'll get it done. And they said, would you do that? Honestly, but it will only be halfway done. I said, no, 100% done and submitted in 30 minutes. I promise you. Will you let me do that for you? And they go, would you please do it? Done. And they're doing it. But it can take years to actually deal with it for yourself and start that journey. What are your thoughts on reflecting on that whole putting it off?
Well, before we go any further, please will you help me with my access to work, because I still haven't done my access to work.
I will.
I still haven't applied for that. I don't know why I haven't. And again, I think possibly because I don't know how it will help me, in as much as, and funny enough, I created a TikTok the other day because we're so used to adapting and finding ways round things. I think sometimes we don't realize that there is an easier way to do something. And the change can feel so scary and overwhelming. It's easier to keep doing something the way that we're doing it than to try and do it differently. I think that's what possibly sometimes holds us back. For me personally, I was like, I've adapted and I've coped. I've done all my qualifications. How is that diagnosis particularly going to help me? And it wasn't until that counsellor said, you need this for your emotional well-being, Jo. That was my trigger. And it's a question I get asked so often by adults is what difference would a diagnosis make to an adult? And it's a really difficult question to answer because in all honesty, the chances are it's probably not going to make a massive amount of difference because you've already adapted. You probably already know what you need to be successful and to function. But I don't think you can underestimate the power of validation and how, for me, I got that diagnosis and actually it was an educational psychologist I worked with who really interestingly, my masking must have been so good because when I approached her, she was like, Jo, you're not dyslexic. You're incredible at communicating. Like, and at the time, I'm sort of embarrassed to admit it, but I was a leading Senko for the island because I was doing such a good job of being a Senko. Schools that were failing were being sent to me to kind of look at how I was doing it. And again, you see, I can't own that. Because I felt like I was a fraud doing that. But she'd never, ever, ever seen me read anything aloud. She'd never seen me write anything down. She just saw me masking and compensating. And I can remember when she said, yeah, you're definitely dyslexic. Like my reading comprehension, my standard score, if there's anybody on here that understands standard scores, my reading comprehension standard score was 65, which is incredibly low.
Oh.
But it's because, and I was like, but you know what? I said, that makes me feel so much better. That is why I read text. And again, it was before audiobooks were invented. Yes. That was why I read my university text 10 times.
Please explain the standard score, please, so that people understand. It's hard to. Can I explain it?
Yes,
can I explain it and you can correct it?
You'll do it much better than me.
Right. So my wife and I were going through our daughter's dyslexia report, and there's all these standard scores and numbers, 65, 120, 95, and so on. And you're like, well, okay, 65, I get that. 65%, yeah? And you're like, no. She's got 120 here and she's got 140 there. And you're like, oh, so it's not a percentage. What is it? But basically, the way to understand it is 100 is bang in the middle of everyone. That's average, middle.
Yeah.
And then if you're a bit better than the middle people, you're like at 110. If you're quite a bit better, you're like 120. And if you're way better, you're like 140,
Yeah.
And then, but if you're a little bit worse, you're 90. If you're quite a bit worse, you're like 80. If you're really not good at it, you're like 70,
Yeah.
And you don't often get something round about the 60s, do you?
No.
Because basically what you're describing is a bell curve, and the middle of the bell curve is 100. And to the right of the bell, on one side of the bell curve is up to about 140, 145. And then down to the bottom of the bell curve's around about the 60, 70. Is that about right?
Yeah. And what happens with the test in order to get those standard scores is they basically test them with a huge sample group of people the same age and then do some clever scientific calculation that I would never be able to do to kind of work out where you would fall in that bell of, what's it called? Standard deviation, isn't it? Yes. So I was like 2 standard deviations and more away from average. So I should say that's like on a first read. So you read the text, they took it away from you and then asked questions.
Oh, I remember when they did with my dyslexia test. She said you can read it as many times as you like the first time. And I read it 3-4 times. Yeah. Then I got given those kindergarten, primary school questions about what did Jack and Jill do and whatever else, And I was like, is this a trick question? Because that wasn't in the story. And she said, there's no trick questions here.
No.
And I said, could I just have a quick look at it? And she's like, absolutely not. And I said, this is definitely a trick question because that wasn't in the story. And then another one wasn't in the story. I'd answered all the questions. Yeah. And when we opened it back up, I said, let me look at the story. I reread the story and I was like, oh my God, It's
Yeah.
actually in there. I couldn't believe
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. So for me, that validated all that extra work that I'd done. So it was
Yes.
worth it. And when I assess adults, it's not actually, I've assessed a few adults recently with reading comprehension, and I hate the reading comprehension test that does that, because I really feel like it like rips the plaster off and exposes your weaknesses that you've kept hidden. I think it it was so validating to just know that all of that effort was worth it, for sure. But it's a tricky one, diagnosis as an adult, because you can't explain it, I don't think, unless you've been through it, the difference it can make. And I think people think your diagnosis is the end of the journey because it
Yeah.
gives you the answers. And for me, it was the start of a whole new journey. And that's what I say to parents. The easy bit is getting the diagnosis. Now you've got to make that report 3D. You've got to put the power into it. I've given you a wand, if you like, but now you have to put the power into that. You have to put the magic into that, interpreting it, empowering your child to negotiate and navigate their way through the dyslexia, get through the education system. But I also think there's a grieving process. Well, there was for me, for sure. And I think quite often when I diagnose children, there's a grieving process for parents as well, because you've suddenly, even though you've suspected it for ages, somehow seeing it in black and white can be quite overwhelming. And I think for me, there was definitely a period, and I can only describe it as grieving because it was a whole range of emotions. You know, to begin with, I just felt so relieved. Then I felt really angry that nobody had picked it up. Look at my GCSE results, they're classic in presentation. Like, why did nobody notice this? Why didn't my English teachers notice that when they made me read aloud, my reading was all over the place? Like, why didn't my English A-level teachers pick up on it? Like, rather than tell me I wasn't university material, why didn't they know about dyslexia? You know, and then I felt very emotional. Well, actually, if I'd have known I was dyslexic, would my confidence have been different? Would I have gone off and been confident enough to have done musical theatre? Like, how differently would my life had been? Like, it was definitely a process that I went through that I had to come to terms with. And actually, my book, Don't Forget to Smile, was that therapeutic, cathartic process, I think, of making sense of my diagnosis, for sure.
So I was speaking to someone about the grieving process with dyslexia the other day, actually, and it seems a bit strange and dramatic to say that. But what are you grieving is the question. So if it's a grieving process, what are you grieving as a parent, and what are you grieving as an individual?
That is a really good question. So for me, I think it was about all of those missed opportunities.
Mm,
It was, for me, it was about missed opportunities and the state of my confidence and self-esteem. You know, I didn't have a single exam access arrangement. Imagine what my results might have been if I'd have just had extra time, because I
yeah,
never finished an exam paper. So
yeah,
actually, my grades were incredible when you think I didn't actually ever finish an exam paper.
yeah,
Like, so I think for me, that's what I was grieving. It was missed opportunities and my life potentially being easier than it could have been. But I think by the time I'd come to terms with it, I'd realised that everything had happened exactly how I needed it to happen, and I hadn't missed out on anything. I think as a parent, grief possibly isn't quite the right word, maybe as a parent, but because I wasn't worried that my child had dyslexia, because I knew what I'd achieved, and I knew how I was going to support him and the girls as well, because they've got it also. I knew how I was going to support him, but there is that initial, this isn't going to be easy. This isn't going to be a straightforward journey. It's going to be a different journey. And once I'd got my head around that, it's all good. But I think that's almost what you're grieving as a parent, that
yeah.
actually it's not going to be as easy as you think getting them through education. However, when you understand and when you know dyslexia and you've come to terms with it, it's not a doddle, but it's doable. It's just
Yes.
a different path. It's just a different journey, and you need to focus on different things.
I was thinking, as a parent, you're often grieving your expectations.
Possibly, yeah.
Like, oh, I expected the school to be like this. I expected it would be like that. And then you get the identification of dyslexia, and you're kind of like, oh, things are different than I expected here.
Yeah.
And you need to adjust your expectations, not down, but to the side
Yeah.
often. Unfortunately, sometimes people do adjust their expectations of their child down because of dyslexia or whatever, in a rare case, but that's a shame. But it's just to the side. You were talking about what is the value of being identified as an adult with dyslexia. And I think there's also a case of doing it for your children,
Yeah.
because once you as an adult become aware of your own dyslexia and then you reflect back on your journey, it helps you help your child on their journey, and you're not traveling so blind. And that's one of the reasons why I think access to work is super important, because you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And once you do this kind of journey of saying, okay, I've got dyslexia, fine. I know it affects me in my workplace maybe a little bit. I'm not quite sure where and how. And I go through a checklist of things, about 30 different things, and with clients, and I say, do you have time difficulty showing up to an appointment on time? Do you often find you're unprepared? Do you find it difficult to take notes during meetings and then send out follow-up information afterwards? Do you find it hard to read reports and digest them in time for the next meeting when everyone else has done it? And do you find it hard replying to an email? Do you find it hard replying to a text? And like, whoa, just hold up a minute. Let me just process all of that. And you're like, oh, I've got another 25 to go, you know? And they're like, that's all to do with dyslexia? And you're like, it certainly can be.
Yeah.
And they're like, and there's solutions to this? And you're like, yes, established solutions. Well, what are they? And then, well, let's go. I want to spend some time finding them out, these different hacks. And you don't know what you don't know. And the beauty of it is, once you do discover what you don't know, you can pick what's useful for you, because we're so good at creating tools round about us. Once we identify them, oh, I'm having some of that, having some of that, you then pass it on to your children as they're growing up through their high school, university, and work. You've got those strategies deployed within your own life. You can model it for them. And I think that's the key, the modeling it for your children. And they have that transparency of seeing, oh, yeah, that's why mum did such and such for dyslexia. That's why mum's got the whiteboard here and that checklist over there and that visual checklist over here and whatever else strategy you've got. So I think another reason to get an adult identification is for your children.
And it's interesting because my son has grown up knowing he's dyslexic really from quite an early age. And he didn't actually get his diagnosis until year 6 because he didn't need it, because school supported him really well. So he didn't need it. But year 6, he needed extra time in SATs, and I wanted it for that transition to secondary school. But, he's grown up knowing that he's dyslexic from a very early age. All of the kids have. Jemima has been, nothing but a dyslexic mum, labelled dyslexic mum. But they know that, exactly like you said, they know the strategies that put in place, but also they know. So let's just talk about dyslexic errors. So missing appointments sometimes with the best will in the world, even when you've written down and checked them, those kind of dyslexic errors that happen with the best will in the world, they happen. They happen to everybody I know, but they happen to people with dyslexia way more often. And it's those things that chip away at confidence and self-esteem and can sometimes make us take a step back and put ourselves back in our invisibility cloak. And it's interesting. So my son is now 18 and he's been in Australia for a year on a gap year. He went completely on his own. The first thing he did within 2 weeks of being there, he found his allies. So I've sort of always taught the kids that you need to find somebody in your workplace, because he's worked as well, or in your school setting, who can be an advocate for you, can empower you, and not necessarily do things for you, but can talk through, because we never know, like with school, you never know kind of like the subtleties of the dynamics between staff and that sort of thing. So I've always taught them to find somebody that if they're worried about something, could be the receptionist, could be the pastoral care person, could be a year head. But to have allies in school, well, within 2 weeks of him he's gone to a school to be a gap student. Within 2 weeks, he had 3 allies, a male and 2 female adults, that he was like, Mum, I've got my allies. Like, and they have been an incredible support to him the whole way through. But then this will make you laugh. He's been in the school most of the time, but he's travelled to different parts of Australia in the school holidays. And he went to Sydney for New Year. And of course, in Australia, when you do internal flights, you don't need your passport. So when he was in Sydney, one of the hostels did ask for his passport, and he didn't have it with him. And the reason why he didn't have it with him was because he couldn't find it before he left. He's actually based in Alice Springs. So I get this text saying, I don't want you to panic, but I don't actually remember the last time I saw my passport. I think I might have lost it. So I just messaged back saying, okay, well, you can't do anything about it for the next 3 weeks. You don't need it for the next 3 weeks. When you get, literally don't think about it, because you can't do anything about it. We'll worry about it when you get back. You're not due back until June. So, we can sort it out in the middle of January. So we didn't think about it, had the most amazing time in Sydney, got back to Alice Springs, and it was the middle of the night my time. And I get this text saying, Mum, I still can't find my passport. So I was like, look, okay, don't panic. You're tired, sleep on it. Tomorrow, double check anywhere it could be. Get one of your adults to also double check everything with you, because sometimes we don't see things. And if you really can't find it, it's not the end of the world. You literally just cancel it, and we'll work out how to order another one. So he was like, yeah, okay. The next text I get, 24 hours later, he still hasn't found it. He's cancelled his passport. He's ordered another one. Mum, can you give me the email address of such and such who I need to countersign my picture? How incredible is that? He didn't panic. It hasn't impacted his confidence and his self-esteem. I played no part in helping him sort that passport out. Of course I would have done if he'd have said, Mum, let's talk through it on the phone. But actually, he feels empowered enough to know that it's just one of those things that's happened. And literally all he needed was the email address of the person to countersign it. How incredible is that at 18 years old? And that's because he's been brought up in a house where when dyslexic errors happen, they happen, we deal with them. It's just one of those things. And he's just been to Perth actually for 2 weeks, and he booked the flights in the wrong month because he booked them in advance. And again, he said, I was tired. I didn't get anybody to double check, Mum. It's my own fault, but I've already sorted it. It cost me an extra 30 quid. It is what it is, isn't it? Whereas, some kids would be, oh my goodness, how do I even begin to go about sorting that out? And I'm so stupid, and I've had to pay extra money, and
Yeah.
But he's just been brought up in a house where it's just how we roll. And, I know this is about dyslexia, but I'm pretty sure I've got ADHD too.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure he's got ADHD too. So when you're dealing with those things together, misplacing things is common practice. But, I just feel really proud that I've brought up a child that actually just deals with it. But the brilliant thing is he's modelling and spreading the word in Australia where he is. This is my dyslexia that's made me book these flights or whatever. And this is how I'm going to deal with it. And one of the adults that is one of his allies out there that's got my number kind of messaged me and said, it's incredible. How has he managed to do that? And I should say, he doesn't have very strong literacy skill. He got a 4 for his maths and English GCSE. And I would say his reading and spelling is functional functional. He for sure isn't massively academic when it comes to the written word, but he uses technology to support him and get by. He dictates everything into either Otter or Google Docs and then edits it from there. He's got strategies, and it's not a thing. Does that make sense? For some people, dyslexia is this massive, great big thing, which is a chain around their neck. And I'm not belittling the struggles, because it's for sure difficult at times, but it's about, I'm going to find it difficult that way. Which way do I need to do it for me?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And it's about working smarter, not harder. I mean, harder is what we're taught at school, just work harder. And then gradually we find ways to work smarter. And often a person comes into our life that says, look, this is a smarter way to do this with the way you think. And you pick up those little things as you go along. So let's carry on the storyline. So we've got to the point of you've got your identification.
Yep.
Let's talk about identification and diagnosis. Okay, you say diagnosis quite a lot, and that's okay. I'm not criticizing at all or anything like that. But how do you feel about the language you use around getting an assessment done? Because some people are quite sensitive about that, like diagnosis is a medical term or whatever. Do you know what I mean? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not going to lie, I haven't even thought about it.
Right.
Like, I haven't even thought about it. I quite often get into trouble on social media because I refer to myself or people as dyslexic, not
Yes.
with dyslexia.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't see that it's something, I haven't got it, I am it.
Right.
So everything, so my life and to this point, the decisions I make, the way I do things, the way I problem solve are owing to my dyslexic brain. But it is what it is. If people would rather say with dyslexia, I don't have a problem with that. I think it's whatever you feel you need to do to make it feel right for you.
Yeah. So how long has it been since you got identified or diagnosed?
10,
10?
yeah, just over 10 years. Yeah, 11 years.
And you stopped being a school Senko and then you shifted over into doing things on your own. Tell us a bit about what's happened over the last 10.
So the timeline before my diagnosis is a bit wonky. Throughout that, leading up to my diagnosis, I got made redundant from my role as a specialist dyslexic teacher for the local authority. And I wasn't in a position to set up my own company at the time with 3 young kids. It was just the wrong time to do it. We wanted to move house. It wasn't the right time to go self-employed. So I actually went to being back to being a Senko, and I found it I loved it, but it's a really thankless job because you're constantly negotiating. You're negotiating with teachers that they need to change their practice and please can they use this resource. You're negotiating with the senior leadership team to try and get more funding and resources to buy more budgets and to fight, well, actually, I need that funding for that TA because that person does need one-to-one support. You're negotiating with parents who feel like you're not doing a good enough job stretching your budget. And after 7 years, I just felt exhausted with it. And I'd actually, by that point, my youngest had started school. And it was a massive mistake. She started school and I went full time as doing special educational needs. And the school I was in at the time, I was special educational needs coordinator, and I oversaw a speech and language provision that we had attached to the school. So I did both things. So it was quite a big role. And I just fell out of love with it. It was just, I'd reached burnout. I was fed up of having to comply. I realized that actually I wasn't using my dyslexic strengths. And also, one of the things that had held me back from setting up my own company was I really wanted the service to be accessible to everybody. I hate in some ways that it's an independent service now that people have to buy into. However, I'd tried to stay in school. So initially, the school I was in had an agreement with 2 other schools that one day of my full-time week, I would go into one of the other schools and do specialist dyslexic stuff. That lasted literally 3 weeks before I went into a school and they said, such and such is off sick today. Can you go and be a supply teacher in there? And I was like, this is not what I'm employed to do. And they just didn't seem to get the value of a specialist dyslexic teacher. So that's how I'd kind of ended up becoming this full-time Senko in this same school. I could just see that there was a gap in service and it was needed. And I'd done a few assessments at the weekend and I thought, actually, there are people that are willing to pay for this. So actually, perhaps I should set up my own, perhaps I should go alone. The big thing that held me back was kind of the accounting. Obviously, I'd worked as a teacher, so I hadn't had to worry about money, like in terms of, tax and pension and all of that sort of stuff. Anyway, by complete coincidence, I was having a conversation with my son's tutor at the time. And she said, you really should go independent. Why don't you? And I said to her, because I just can't get my head around the finances and I can't afford an accountant. And accountants use long words that I don't understand. And she said, contact this guy. He's a friend of my son's. He's incredible. He will help you. And that's exactly what he did. I sent him an email and was like, this is my plan. This is what I want to do. I don't know whether I need to be self-employed. I don't know whether I need to be limited company. I don't understand the first thing about tax or bookkeeping or any of it. And he was like, don't worry, I'm going to talk you through it. We're going to do the whole lot and it's not going to be expensive. So that accountant, and I still use him today, he is just incredible, is the reason why, because that was my big barrier why I couldn't do it. So I set up 9 years ago. And at the time, literally all I wanted to do was earn enough money to pay my mortgage. It was literally about doing enough assessments each month to cover the bills, because obviously we'd had a 2 dual income. Our mortgage was secured on that. So me suddenly not having my teacher's salary was obviously going to make a big difference. So I just needed to match my teacher's salary. So my plan was to literally just find assessments. And obviously, 9 years ago, if we're honest, social media was still in early days. It was pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
So online working was still quite rare. But obviously I used social media, and I just had a Facebook business page initially, to kind of advertise events in my local area, not even online events. But it became apparent that I was quite good at social media. And then the pandemic hit and I couldn't do any assessments, because initially we weren't allowed to assess online. Luckily, they have since reviewed that and we can do it remotely. And I had to earn a certain amount of money to pay the bills. I never applied for any grants. I probably should have done. So I reverted back to teaching, created an online virtual classroom, taught groups, taught small groups, taught pairs of children, taught siblings. I taught 70 children a week in the main bulk of the pandemic online using Zoom. And I'm really proud of that, because technology scared the living daylights out of me. But actually, I embraced it. I was like, if I want to keep my house, this is what I'm going to have to do. And I loved it. I loved teaching, but it's not where my passion is, and it's not where my real strength is. Sadly, I didn't get on TikTok in the pandemic. I was a bit later. I think had I got on TikTok in the pandemic, it might have been an even different story again. But, we came out of the pandemic and I was still doing quite a lot of teaching, because basically parents didn't want me to stop teaching their children, because they were so scared we were going to go back into lockdown again. So I had sort of 2 years where I was juggling quite a lot of assessment and quite a lot of teaching. And I realized that if I didn't change that, I was going to reach burnout. And slowly but surely, I've been winding the students down. And in January, I made the decision I no longer do any teaching, just teach one home educated child. And I do all assessment and all social media. That's what I do now.
And the last couple of years, you've had quite a lot of TikTok kind of interest, haven't you? You're quite prolific on there.
Yeah. So I think what happened was, as we came out of the pandemic, and I knew that I needed to move away from teaching. I knew that I wanted to do more parent courses online, actually. I started working with a couple of different business coaches, because obviously my background was in education. So, running a business isn't that difficult if you use your intuition, but we all need guidance at different times. So I bought into a couple of different online business coaches and worked through their courses to kind of get the confidence really to do stuff online. And one of them said, you need to get your face on TikTok. And I was like, you say that? I've got 3 teenagers that are on TikTok. And all I really ever saw them do was dances. And I was like, they're going to go mad if I go on TikTok. They'll be mortified, because it's the young person's platform. And she was like, look, I'm telling you, TikTok is your platform. I've known you for 5 or 6 years, like online through whatever. And she said, I know that TikTok is going to be where you are going to make it. And I was like, I'm not really sure about that. And I really cringe when I look at my early videos. They're just mortifyingly embarrassing. But, everybody has to start somewhere. You just give it a go. Didn't tell the kids I was on there. Didn't really understand how TikTok worked, if I'm honest, that there was this For You page that literally anybody in the entire world can tap into. And I must have been on there for about 3 months. And my son sidled into this very office and he was like, Mum, when did you join TikTok? And I was like, oh, a little while ago. How do you know? And he went, because you have just come up on my For You page. And I was like, please, please, please don't tell your sisters that I'm on there. And they even laugh at how I say For You page, because I say For You page instead of For You. It's a bit of a dyslexic thing going on there. But I was like, how do you know? And he went, because, Mum, you've got a video that's going viral. And I was like, what do you mean it's gone viral? And he went, this video's had 10K views. And until that point, my videos had only had like 300 views. I think I'd had one that had 1,000, which I thought was good. So he went, the reason why I'm telling you this, Mum, is because you need to understand that there's going to be hate comments. Because when things go viral, like people, like there's trolls and all sorts. And I just need you to know that you just ignore and you block the nasty people. He was about 16 at the time. It's like, oh, bless you, thank you. Anyway, with that, the other two appeared and they were like, Mum, you're on TikTok. You've come up on our For You pages. And basically, it's just grown from there. And it blows my mind. I've got 105 followers now, although it's really slowed down since the Dyslexia show. I don't know why. I think your video was the last
105,000.
Yeah, 105,000, I
yeah.
should say. Yeah. I think your video was the last video I had that went quite big.
Yeah, 500,000 views or something like that.
I'll have a little look.
I did one video for Natalie and one video for you, and both of them went big.
The TikTok is your platform, I reckon. But yeah, it's interesting. It's slowed down a bit now, but it kind of does that. But like, if you'd have said to me, again, like with Vinny being in Australia, I guess, if you'd have said to me, you know, you're going to have 105,000 followers on TikTok in 2 years' time, I would never have believed you, because it just 276.2 thousand views it had. And that was your top tip for dyslexic adults. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was about access to work, wasn't it?
That was about access to work, but there were lots of comments about nasty comments as well. But there always are when it goes viral. It's always are when things go viral. There always are. But I think it's grown into a beast that I never imagined it would grow into. And dare I use the word influencer? Like, apparently that's what I am now. I have worked with a couple of companies to sort of endorse products or even research products.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that's really exciting because I finally feel like, you know, and if I'm honest, being visible on TikTok has brought up a lot of old stuff for me in terms of, you know, I spent so much of my school education, as I said earlier on, keeping myself invisible, worrying that my voice wasn't quite right, worrying that I hadn't quite understood stuff.
Yeah.
That it's been and it continues to be a journey. So, you know, initially when videos went viral, if there were lots of hate underneath them or people telling me they were wrong, I'd actually remove them because I'd panic that I hadn't got the information right.
Oh, you'd remove the video, not the comments.
I'd remove the video, not the comments. No. I'd remove the video and I'd be like, actually, what if I haven't understood that correctly? Like, what if I haven't got it right?
Yeah.
That sort of happened for the first 6 months, I guess. Now I'm so confident with it. Like, literally, I just block individual people. And actually, even sometimes now when people disagree with me, I'll maybe even make a video because actually it's okay for people to disagree with you. And I think that's where my inner confidence has really grown.
Yeah.
It's okay for people to disagree with you because actually they're coming from their viewpoint. I'm coming from my viewpoint. I never have an issue with somebody telling me I'm wrong if they're coming from a viewpoint that they can validate, if that makes sense. I have an issue with people telling me they're wrong just for the sake of telling me they're wrong.
Yeah.
But actually, I don't claim to know everything.
Yes.
You know, and that's where the platform is really powerful because we can connect and we can build on our thinking.
Yes.
However, LinkedIn still scares the hell out of me.
Oh,
and I had a conversation with Louise Selby about this at the Dyslexia show. I still so tentatively hang out on there. And I know that that's where I need to be really to make the professional connections.
Yeah.
But I just find it really difficult. And I don't know if actually, because in order to access it, quite often you have to read a lot of language. You quite often have to read.
Because TikTok is just, you hear it straight away, you see it, you get it. Any gaps in your understanding are filled in by the multimedia.
Yeah.
And then you can swipe on. But LinkedIn, you know, you've got like 3 swipes worth of text to read through to properly digest it and then make a realistic comment rather than, oh, nice, thank you, well done, or whatever, you know?
Or I've experienced this trait, you know, because I've said it first of all, you know, you have to, so I think that it's a double whammy. I find it difficult to access because of my own dyslexia, but then I feel like, and again, this is a mindset I definitely need to change, but I feel like it's where all the intelligent people hang out. And I feel like I'm back in that English classroom with
Oh,
teachers waiting to catch me out,
ah,
like people
yes.
waiting to say, no, you haven't got that right. Actually, it's da 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 da. I'm much more wary. But again, it's a process. I'm chipping away at it.
Yeah,
Like I'm aware of it. So therefore, I can confront it head on. Whereas, you know, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have probably even have had an
yeah.
account on there. And the other thing that's made a really big difference for me is I've managed to find, so I have one member of staff that helps me. She helps me with my social media because I wanted to be on all platforms. And she helps me schedule posts, which I'm not very good at. So we do a month in advance, and she then posts on Facebook, LinkedIn, Facebook Business, and Instagram for me, my content, but she posts it. But what's really interesting is she picks videos that I would probably never share on certain platforms.
Ah,
But I think that's really good because she said, I don't know why you wouldn't share it. Like, it's a really good point, Joe. I've learned from that. We're getting it out there. So she has been brilliant in terms of actually putting me out there and making me. So it's like recently I recorded an episode of the Island Stories podcast. I would never have emailed and gone, hey, I've got a really good story. Like, let me share it with you. But she picked up that this podcast was up and coming. She messaged them and said, one of my clients is incredible. Da, 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 da. Find her on social media. Da, 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 da. And that's how I got that interview. So it's amazing because I've got this person that's advocating for me and really pushing me out of my comfort zone. Because sometimes she comments on things or she says things. Most of the time it's me commenting, but every now and again she'll comment and she'll message me and she'll say, by the way, she said, I've pushed you out of your comfort zone because I've just commented on such and such's post. So make sure you check in on that. So she like totally gets me. And actually my aim is, so we're in the process of a rebrand at the moment. So I've been another way around dyslexia support in terms of my professional limited company. But at Dyslexic Life with Joe Rees has taken off so much on TikTok, and I've got a podcast with the same name. We've decided to make all of the social media platforms at Dyslexic Life with Joe Rees. So I'm still delivering all the same services that I was before, but we're just in the process of creating another website that will run alongside that as at Dyslexic Life with Joe Rees. And I have spoken to Rosie, my marketing lady, about this, but my plan is eventually I want her to work for me full time because she just gets what the business is trying to do. And interestingly, she isn't dyslexic, but I think that's why it works quite well. She has a brother that has dyslexia, but she is quite keen to help me get my message out there and just gets what I'm trying to do. She can interpret the crazy text messages I send her that have got 1,000,001 ADHD and dyslexic typos in them. So it's interesting that some of that social media journey has not necessarily been driven by me. TikTok, all me. That scary somehow felt less threatening. Even though anybody can watch it, it's literally only people that choose to follow you that really get to see your videos. Whereas Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram, I just feel like it's not like yesterday's news as much. It's easier to go back and look for it. Whereas TikTok moves at such a fast pace, even though it's there forever, it moves on quite quickly. Does that make
yeah,
sense?
yeah, yeah. Joe, that's been fantastic. We've been going for, it's been great to hear your
I'm
whole
sorry.
story. No, it's brilliant. It's been fantastic. I'm sure the listeners will love it. I've loved it. And
You might
we've
want to
been,
edit it down.
I'm not going to edit it down. Not going to
Oh,
edit
okay.
anything of it. It's just great. Might be a few little things where you, no, we'll keep it as is. It's great. And we'll put all the links to your resources in the show notes. So
Yeah.
if you, as listeners, if you want to swipe up just now on whatever you're listening to, there will be the show notes and the hyperlinks to Joe's TikTok,
Yeah.
Joe's assessment side of things, Joe's awareness side of things that you've mentioned. They'll
Yeah.
all be in the show notes below. And
Amazing.
would you like to share any kind of final parting thoughts for people listening?
Yeah. So I think for me, with dyslexia, it's very easy to focus on what we can't do. And actually, we can always do something. And everybody is going to be at a different point in their journey. And it's about looking at where you are right now and what is your next step to either accepting dyslexia, understanding dyslexia, using dyslexia to your advantage in your career. Like, what is one tiny thing you can do to move towards that? Because we can always do something, no matter how small it is. So yeah, I think that would be my parting gift to you.
Fantastic. And I think the one final thing for you, one next step for you is you and me to get on a phone call for half an hour, fill in that access to work form.
Yeah. Okay. I agree.
Okay. Next week. Do you agree
Yes,
to next
definitely.
week?
Definitely.
Okay. Great. All right. See you
Cool.
later, Joe.
Thanks. See you later.
Bye. This podcast is sponsored by dyslexiaproductivitycoaching.com. It's my day job when I'm not hosting this podcast. Tell me, do you know what you want to achieve in the workplace, but you're struggling with how to achieve it? Maybe you suspect some traits of dyslexia are getting in the way. Well, that's where Dyslexia Productivity Coaching comes in, because we give you a simple productivity system for your Apple devices that harnesses the creativity that comes with your dyslexia. It includes proven methods like note-taking, reminders, speech-to-text, mind mapping, and more, all tailored to your needs. It'll free up your time and help you achieve outstanding results. Book a complimentary call to discuss it with me, and if you do it soon, I may also be available to coach you personally via Zoom. So don't be shy, go to dyslexiaproductivitycoaching.com or swipe up and book it now.